Hello, I'm the Grub Street Lodger, and it's a beautiful sunny day. It's still quite cold, but I'm going to talk about what I read in February. So I started the month with The Young Pretender by Michael Arditti. Now, this is about William Betty, and I actually read about William Betty last year when I read a book about the clown Grimaldi, and William Betty was just sort of a sub-story. He was an actor who, for a year, commanded all the stage. He performed with some of the biggest people. He had crowds coming from it. It was like Beatlemania. It was known as Betty Mania, and people actually died in these crowds. People fought duels over not whether he was good or bad, but which role he was best at. And William Betty was 12. So you had this 12-year-old kid doing love scenes with 40-year-old women and fighting duels with 60-year-old men, and it was brilliant apparently. And I really wanted to read a biography of him. And when I saw this in the shop, I thought, "Ooh, biography," but it wasn't. It's a novel, and it's a novel about him coming back when he's 21, the ripe old age of 21, to make his stage return. And William Betty in this is really likeable. He's quite humble. He knows all this fuss was about him when he was younger, and he hopes that getting older and having more experiences has made him a better actor. Though he's quite prepared to acknowledge that maybe he was a fad and not that great an actor in the first place. So he's just humbly trying to be a decent actor, but because of the huge flair of his initial launch into society, people finding him rather disappointing now. Downside of the book is there's a lot of stuff in it about memory. He's blocked all his memories, and so he doesn't. They're uncovered as the book goes on, and I get it as a sort of way of structuring the book, but there's no way that somebody when they're 21 would forget that when they were 12 these certain things happened to them. I don't think, and so that's a little bit. I was going to say stagey, which yeah, fair enough. It's a little bit ish. Also, I mean, were I to write a book about Betty, I would write a farce about him in his prime. This 12-year-old with these legions of fans and things. But what Michael Arditi's done is, I think, far more respectable and respectful. In fact, poor old Betty, he actually killed himself after a second attempt at a theatre comeback. So it's quite a sad story in real life. So I think the more sombre way of treating this book was probably the kinder one, though maybe not the most entertaining. I followed this up with The Adventures of Simplicissimus by, I need to look at this, Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelhausen. And so it's a novel-ish. It's a little bit early novel. It's 1700s, it's 30 Years' War, and our main character is growing up with a farming family, and then a whole bunch of Swedes come and torture everybody, and they make his dad being licked by a goat, and they shove things up people's asses, and he runs away, and he joins a hermit and lives as a hermit, and then he comes out and he becomes a fool, a jester, and then he becomes sort of a mercenary, and he becomes a very successful mercenary, and then a soldier and a quack, and it's what they call Bildungsroman. He goes through all different bits of societies, and it's all about, well, is he going to survive? How's he going to survive? What's he going to do? And it really sums up the whole nature of the 30 Years' War, which, in terms of percentage of population killed, is one of the most bloody wars ever. It just sums up how nothing is safe, nothing is sacred, and nothing can be relied upon. And so Simplicissimus, he's so called because he's a bit simple. It's a bit like, I suppose you could say Forrest Gump living the 30 Years' War. But that gives him skills and allows him to ride his luck. And so there's an element where there's not any stakes to the book. It's each sort of little event and thing is quite fun and enjoyable to read, and the translation's really interesting. It has a really colloquial translation into a sort of London slang, really. They're talking about blokes and, get shut up in the clink and shushy mush and all this kind of stuff, which is a quite interesting way of translating this book and making it seem, fresher. But it does mean the stakes are a little bit lacking, and so although it's enjoyable, you kind of can go away from it, and you have to bring yourself back to it. It doesn't pull you through exactly, but it was very enjoyable nonetheless. One of the books that distracted me from it was this beauty, Ducks, the Legend, Ducks, Art, Legend, History. It's written by an Italian woman called Anna Giorgetti, and translated by, just say somewhere, Helena Ramsey. Anyway, it's about ducks. It really is. It's about myths and legends of ducks. For example, ducks are sort of holy beings in certain Sanskrit texts, and they carry souls. There's the ugly duckling. There's ducks in fairy tales and Grimm's fairy tales, and so ducks have this presence in myth and legend. A presence which old Anna greatly overemphasizes because she loves ducks. Oh, she loves them. She keeps referring to them as her little friends. At one point she says it's clearly obvious that ducks are better than all the other birds because they can deal with the three elements, air, water, and land. And even though they waddle a bit on land, they're still alright on it. And so they are the best of the best. At one point she says that ducks might be the mythological progenitors of human beings in Native American myth, but even she admits that her love of ducks might be taking her a bit too far at this particular point. And it's illustrated by various china and porcelain ducks. Some other materials. For example, where is it? This is my favourite chapter title, My Darling, My Duck. And there's this little plastic duck, and it says this: a clever idea from the Ramada chain of hotels in England. This plastic duck, with its comic expression, is to be found in every one of their bathrooms. A session with this aquatic friend leaves even the tiredest business person feeling relaxed and laughing. And they're like, it's just a plastic duck, mate. So yeah, I adore this book. I love it for its portentous title. I love it for its just random, there you go, there's a china duck. I love it for the complete bias that the author has for ducks. She just loves ducks. She adores the ducks. And I adore her for it. It's brilliant. Sorry for the jump, but something came up. Right, so the next book I read was Zoe Gilbert, Mischief Acts. Now, Zoe Gilbert wrote Folk, which was a book that was one of my favourite books, I think 2020 or 2019. And it was a book about an island just off Scotland where their lives are slightly more integrated with fairy tales and folk tales than ours are. And it was over a couple of generations, and so the stories of the first generation start becoming part of the folk tales of the second and the third and things. And it was really good, and she's really, really good at senses as well. You don't just see things in her books, you taste them, you smell them. It really brings it to life. But the one thing I wanted was something more grounded, because this island was somewhere away, set aside. I wanted somewhere grounded and real, and this definitely does that, because it's set in the Great North Wood, which is sort of Norwood and Croydon and Dulwich and things, and so quite close to me and places I've been. And also, what's really great about this book is it's about how the wood changes through time. And so, originally it's a big wild wood, and then it becomes sort of game preserves, and then suburbs, and then houses, and then, actually, the last section is all about the future, in which the area is being rewilded, which is really cool. And so there's an ebb through it of enchantment, where it's like the mystical wood, where fairy tales could still live, disenchantment, and then re-enchantment. And the central figure, though not the central character, is Herne the Hunter. And Herne the Hunter is an interesting kind of mythical creature, because he's linked to horned gods of the Celtic, and he's linked to the Wild Ride, and he's linked to all sorts of things. But the first actual mention of him is by Shakespeare in Merry Wives of Windsor. Um, so, so in some ways he's old and he's not old, and he's linked to all these things and he's not, and I like that. But she shapes it a little bit more, as indeed one of my favourite writers, William Harrison Ainsworth. He used Herne the Hunter in his book Windsor Forest, or was it Windsor Castle, Windsor something, which Herne the Hunter is a psychopomp who goes around stealing souls. But he's not in this. He's element of nature. He is the mischief and the trickster. And so in the eras when nature is more sort of wild and rampant, he's more powerful, and in the areas where it's more cut back, he's more constrained. And I really loved the different ways it changed. So stories are all told in different ways, fitting their time period. So the first one has a sort of ballady feel. The second one is all about Elaine, the theatre owner who set up Dulwich College, and about a mysterious man called Herne, who organises his revels for Christmas, and it all goes out of hand. And then, other times Herne is just sort of an idea, or a notion, or someone with just slightly weird hair who might be otherworldly, and so each story is very different. And so there's a romantic comedy, there's a farce, there's an 18th century one about a genuine actress who's from that area and who later went on to shock the 18th century quite a bit, which, considering how unshockable you'd think the 18th century might be, is something. One of my favourites was called Nymphs, and it plays on the name of nymph as like a baby moth. I think it's a moth, and of course a voluptuous, nymph-like, woman. And so there's two women who obviously love each other but are too shy to properly come together because it's the 60s, and it's, free love's in the air, but they're still not quite sure about things. And these human nymphs, moth ladies, come to their party and give them all LSD, and they all get high and see Herne. And that's a really good one. There's one about when Crystal Palace burnt down, as it really did. There's a very silly one about a man who bashes his head in a hot air balloon accident and starts seeing little fairies. And I really love this story. I love how each time period gets its own story. I love how the story of the wood and Herne as sort of the embodiment of the wood carries on and has this flow through the whole thing. I love the positive ending of the woods being rewilded and magic coming back and people getting in touch with the nature and indeed with their mischievous side. And the destruction in some of these of mischief acts, but also the creation inherent in certain mischief acts. I thought that was very interesting. This is brilliant. I really like this. And if you liked folk, which I think did quite well, go for this, which I think hasn't done as well, because this is better in my opinion. It's more grounded. It's more interesting. It has more ideas in it. I think it's very, very good. Now, the next thing I read for the Samuel Johnson book group. It's called The Georgians. It's about Georgians. Georgians, Deeds and Misdeeds of 18th Century Britain by Penelope J. Corfield. And she's going to be there at the event next Tuesday. And yeah, it'd be very interesting talking to her. What it is it's a comprehensive skim, I think I would describe it. It sort of takes in the whole of the Georgian era. She doesn't just go 18th century, she goes long 18th century. Sometimes she goes back as far as Charles II and as forward as far as Victoria. Her 18th century is a bit longer than most other people's, I feel. But yeah, the very, very long 18th century, 200 years of it. But she does so, I think, to plot the shape of the time. And so various trends and shapes. Because she's not a historian of, the great people. There are anecdotes and names, and you hear there's a little Johnson stuff in there, and Kit's Mark gets a mention, and this kind of thing. But it's not about that kind of thing. It's about people as individuals, but because historically it's hard to know people as individuals to a certain extent, it's also about them as groups. And so there's a story about how the notion of working class rather than just poor comes up. these are the contributing members of society, and the ones we shit on, and how they form a consciousness, middle class, and their sort of dangerous, not quite here nor there-ness, but how they grow in confidence and essentially control the narrative of the era. And the aristocrats, how the traditional royal roles and aristocratic roles become less important in the 18th century, but how they still have this sort of place in there and play themselves. They're not completely useless yet, as they are now. Get rid of them. And yeah, very, very interesting. I really loved all this stuff. And yeah, good old shape. The only problem for me was, I've been interested in the 18th century for about 15 years now. I've read quite in depth on some of these things. And a comprehensive skim only gives me that sense of the shape. That's the only real thing I got out of it was, oh, yes, these are how these things I already know come together. There wasn't a lot of me discovering new things through this book, which was a bit of a shame. But if you want to have a good sort of overview of the 18th century, this is quite good. Also, the end of each chapter, it was written, came out last year, and there's a real, I would almost say, lack of confidence in this book, in that they keep wanting to say about what we think of the Georgians now, what they thought of themselves, how they questioned themselves, how they didn't question themselves, and how we question them. And so there's a kind of nervousness about this book almost, about just asserting that these people 300 years ago thought like people 300 years ago. There's a little bit of wibbliness on that. And then the other thing is that each chapter has this thing called Time Shift Then and Now, which give you places to visit related to the chapter, which didn't add much. Didn't really make it, make it more relevant for me. Oh, look, I can visit one of these houses that she was mentioning, that kind of thing. It seemed a bit like a publisher's note, and I'd be interested to ask her if it was. Okay, so the last thing I read in the month was called Moonraker by F. Tennyson Jesse, and I'll tell you now, the F stands for Fryniwyd. Fryniwyd, awesome name. And Moonraker, this has come out before the Bond film. There's no going into space in this. The Moonraker is a pirate ship, and the Moonraker captures Jackie. And the Moonraker has on it a captain, Captain Lovell, who has certain secrets, which I probably will spoil in a minute. And they go to Santo Domingo, and on the way they capture a French ship and meet a Frenchman. And he is a friend of Toussaint Louverture. And so they get there, and the Frenchman wants to hire the Moonraker to save him and his family. Toussaint Louverture and his family, because the French are coming and they're going to take over. And then we kind of follow around Toussaint Louverture? Toussaint? Probably Toussaint. We follow him around in his last campaign, the one where he was essentially tricked into giving up and then was imprisoned, and it's quite tragic, to be honest. It's this. The book was written in the 1920s. There are words that you would not use now. Most of them are in the voices, in the characters of the kind of people who might say it, but some of them are in the narrative voice. And there's this whole thing where the main character is surprised that one of the greatest, most inspiring people he's ever met is black, which, he probably would be, being his, but it still reads a bit funny, where he's like, he was the greatest, realest person I've ever met. I saw all of humanity in his face, and it was a black face. It doesn't land quite right now, but you can see one. Not so much where it was when it was written. But you can see how the character at the time might think that, I suppose. And then, interestingly, he keeps calling him ugly, despite saying he's beautiful. He's graceful, but he's graceless. He's hideous, but he's amazing. And then, he doesn't go on the Moonraker. And the Moonraker goes off, and the Frenchman's been causing a bit of problems on the ship, and it turns out it's because the captain of the ship is actually a woman and has fallen in love with the Frenchman. And the crew are now, what? You're a woman? This is awful. And they mutiny, and she solves the problem by blowing everybody up. I told you there'd be spoilers. And there's some links between sort of her freedom as a man, but her inauthenticity compared with Toussaint Louverture's gaining of freedom, from being a slave, and his authenticity. That's all very interesting. And the main character's called the author's called Fryniwyd, so that's great. And that's all I read in February. So, not loads, partly because Simplicissimus took a bit longer than I expected. But yeah. But now, here's a little bonus section. I've taken up play reviewing. And so I'm going to give just a very brief overview of the plays I saw this month. Here, I cut them on a post-it note. Just like, oh, there's no way of me just sort of sticking it in so you see the corner. Right, here you go. So the first I went to see was called Triptych by a group called Peeping Tom. They are dance performance. There's no words in it. Most of them are contortionists, and they use that to sort of portray a bunch of terrifying, nightmarish visions. They writhed and wriggled and clicked and clacked around the stage. There was one point where a man killed a woman and picked her up and tried to dance with her, and her foot went backwards as he was trying to dance with it, and there was a bit with somebody with a backwards head, and a door that nobody should have been able to get through, but this man who was naked, but for his clicking and his clacking, wiggled through it, and he ran up to this woman. She went, and she went against the wall, and then hands came out the wall and grabbed her, and it was icky, but very gripping. So that was that. The next thing I saw was called I Fucked You in My Spaceship. A title which seems like it's going to promise quite a lot, doesn't it? But it was actually a rather bland relationship drama. There were two men and two women. The two men got in another man to spice up their love life. The two women got in a man to be a sperm donor. It turned out both these two men were cuckoos in the nest and took over the relationships. So yeah. You call it I Fucked You in My Spaceship. I expect a bit more, to be honest, but there you go. Next thing was David Copperfield. This was 3 actors and a musician. 2 of the actors played all the sort of Dickens side characters, and they had great fun doing it. One was little, one was large, and they made great use of that physicality. The third actor was sort of the straight man as David Copperfield, but he had a lot of fun with that too. And then there was a musician who sat completely until he played his music, and it was actually done as a musical. There were some really good little musical bits about it. One about how flat Norfolk is. One just wishing the audience well in the interval. One where the Macaubers sing about their philosophy of life. Yeah, it was very good, and it was very, very lovely. The audience. I recognised so many people. Quite a few actresses from like sitcoms and things I saw as a kid. About 4 or 5 of those. And I may have been talking to Simon Russell Bill. I'm not sure. So yeah, very lovely performance, that one. The thing I saw after that was Burnt City. They're not Mischief Theatre. They do. What are they called? The ones where you wear a mask and you walk around. And I went alone because it recommended I go alone, and I found that meant that I wasn't as interested in it, because when I went with someone, I could be like, you weren't allowed to talk, but showing them things. But now I was just seeing things and thinking, no, that's kind of interesting. So I followed an actor for a bit and didn't really follow the story, and then just walked around all the sets and thought, this is really cool. I've been before, so like what they do, I've forgotten the name of the bloody theatre company, but what they do is really impressive. But maybe not. I didn't find it as impressive the second time. So I went to one set in Hollywood a few years ago, and this was set in sort of fictional Troy kind of thing, and it's still very impressive. But I knew what to expect, so it wasn't surprising and impressive, I suppose. Yeah. So the next thing I saw was called Home X. That was a very interestingly conceived thing. So there was an actor in Hong Kong and there was an actor in London, and they were performing with VR stuff, and their performances were being translated into a computer game. Also in the computer game was a more normal actor being an avatar who was guiding you through the story, and half the audience were avatars themselves at home who could just hop around and watch the story as they wanted. And then we were there in the theatre with this screen all around us, and one of the actors and the musician. So we were essentially watching the story, which is all on the screen, but also sort of behind the scenes, which was the person putting the music in and the person doing the actions. I think if this will be the future of, if it could be a future of entertainment, we'll probably all just go in the screen. I don't think there'll be an audience there, because we were, as the audience, probably the most passive of the participants, but it was still very interesting, enjoyable, partly because the story was really simple. It was some human beings go to this lovely Mario world, and they're escaping from their destroyed home, and they go, right, well, we could turn this into our home. Hence, a lovely, very human bit of destruction, and they learn a lesson and stuff. Now, the last thing I saw in February was called Healing King Herod. This was a one-person show. It was by a genderqueer person who was like a drag queen, drag king Herod. The Bible killing one from the in fact, there wasn't much more in the way of research than that. They didn't even know which Herod they were, to be honest. But the baby killing one from the Bible, and they've given up their baby killing ways, and they just want to help and give back. And so we're trying to con the audience into a self-help session, series of sessions that would cost a lot of money. But this was the first free session. This was a taster session. And so Herod was giving us a mindfulness self-help lecture. And it was a wonderful parody of all the mindful self-help guff that there is. All these pointless graphs that didn't really lead to anything. And breathe in through your mouth and out through your chakras. But also, as it was going on, Herod was revealing more of the twitchy psycho inside. It was essentially about finding your inner child and not massacring it. And at the end, Herod very much found their inner child, leaving with a very striking last image, which I'll leave you to guess at. So there you go. That's the end of bonus section. What I saw, and that's also what I read. And thank you very much.